All right, so let's jump right into it today. A deep dive on childhood vaccines. I know you're all pretty interested in learning more about this, especially with all this recent stuff going on with the measles outbreak in Texas. So we're going to be looking at a piece from Science News today called "What Experts Say About Childhood Vaccines Amid the Texas Measles Outbreak." And it features some pretty insightful perspectives from a
Well,
couple of
yeah.
leading doctors in the field.
Yeah, for sure. And it's really interesting, the timing of this Texas measles outbreak,
Yeah.
that it's really kind of put this topic of vaccines back into the spotlight. It sparked this whole new wave of discussions about, the role of vaccine in public health in our modern world.
Absolutely. And the article itself really highlights some of this tension, especially with, certain public figures like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who have, questioned kind of the established science on vaccines. But then on the other hand, we have these really powerful stories from the experts featured in the article, like Dr. Aditya Gaur, who's, worked in India before vaccines were readily available and has seen firsthand, the really devastating impact of some of these vaccine preventable diseases. And then we also have Dr. Kazar Talat, who is an infectious diseases doctor and vaccine safety researcher whose own family history with polio really underscores the importance of this discussion.
Yeah, those two perspectives really offer a valuable lens, I think, for examining this really complex issue. And especially, in light of what's happening in Texas right now with this measles outbreak.
Right, and that really brings us to the heart of this whole issue, which is how do vaccines actually work? We always hear about them, training the immune system, but what does that actually mean?
Well, think of your immune system as kind of a highly advanced, defense force. It's constantly patrolling your body, looking for these invaders like viruses and bacteria. And so what a vaccine does is it essentially gives your immune system kind of like a wanted poster with the picture of the enemy. And this wanted poster could be like a weakened or inactive version of the virus or even just fragments of it. The key is that it allows your immune system to recognize and develop a plan of attack without actually having to, fight a full-blown infection.
Oh, I see. So it's like a targeted training exercise,
Yeah,
preparing for a specific threat.
exactly. And the really cool thing is that when the real virus or bacteria shows up, your immune system's already primed and ready to fight back, which often prevents you from getting sick in the first place.
That makes sense. But I think some people would argue that natural immunity, like getting sick and recovering, is a better way to build immunity than actually getting vaccinated because you've gone through the actual battle, so to speak. What do our experts have to say about that?
Well, Dr. Gaur's perspective on this is really insightful. Having worked in India, before vaccines were widespread, he saw firsthand the really brutal reality of diseases like measles. And he points out that while surviving these illnesses might give you immunity, you're taking a pretty big gamble because measles, for instance, can lead to some serious complications like pneumonia, encephalitis, and even death. But vaccines, on the other hand, they offer this safe and controlled way to achieve immunity without those risks.
That's interesting because it challenges this whole idea of getting sick as being natural and therefore somehow better. It kind of reminds us that our bodies are complex and sometimes we need a little help to fight off these really powerful diseases.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And, this brings us back to the outbreak in Texas, which really highlights the consequences of what can happen when vaccination rates decline.
Yeah, the article mentioned 146 cases, 20 hospitalizations, and even a death. And that death was an unvaccinated child. It's a pretty stark reminder of what's at stake here.
Yeah, and what's even more concerning is that most of those cases were in people who were either unvaccinated or whose vaccination status was unknown. And this really underscores this concept of herd immunity that we kind of touched on earlier.
Yeah, this whole idea of herd immunity is really fascinating to me. Can you explain that a little bit more? Like, why does my vaccination status potentially impact someone who maybe can't get vaccinated?
Yeah, so imagine a community where most people are vaccinated against a specific disease. The chances of an outbreak happening are pretty low because the virus or bacteria has a really hard time finding a host to infect. So this ends up creating kind of like a protective shield or herd immunity. And this protects even those who aren't vaccinated, like infants who are too young for certain vaccines or people with compromised immune systems. However, if the vaccination rates drop, that shield weakens, and that increases the risk of outbreaks for everyone.
It really paints a clear picture of how interconnected we all are when it comes to public health. It's not just about individual choices, it's about the collective well-being of the whole community.
Exactly. And unfortunately, the article points to a pretty worrying trend here in the U.S., where MMR vaccination rates among kindergartners have been falling, which makes us more vulnerable as a society.
So it seems like we're facing kind of a paradox. We have this incredibly powerful tool in vaccines that could potentially eradicate these devastating diseases, but at the same time, we're seeing this decline in trust and uptake, which is putting us all at risk.
Yeah, it's this really complex interplay of different factors,
Mm.
everything from scientific understanding to how people perceive things socially. And navigating all of this is absolutely crucial for protecting public health.
That's a perfect segue into this next question, which is how effective are vaccines actually? It's one thing to say that they work, but can we actually quantify that? Does the data back it up?
Yeah, the data is actually incredibly compelling. The article mentions a study that found that globally vaccines have saved something like 154 million lives over the past 50 years. That's just an insane number.
It's hard to even wrap your head around the scale of that impact. And what about here in the US specifically?
Well, in 2019 alone, routine childhood vaccinations prevented something like 24 million cases of diseases like tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, and others. And that's just in 1 year.
Wow, those numbers are really powerful. They really put into perspective the real world impact of these vaccines. It's not just theoretical, it's literally saving millions of lives and preventing a lot of suffering.
Yeah, it truly is one of the greatest public health achievements in human history.
Now, I want to switch gears a bit here because I think a lot of people have questions about the childhood vaccine schedule. It can seem overwhelming at times with so many vaccines given at different ages. How is this schedule actually determined?
Well, that's a question that comes up a lot, and it really speaks to the careful consideration that goes into developing these recommendations. It's not just arbitrary. It's the result of years and years of research and really meticulous analysis by experts who weigh the benefits and risks of each vaccine at these different stages of development.
Oh, so it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
No, not at all. One of the key factors is understanding when children are most vulnerable to certain diseases. For example, rotavirus, which can cause severe dehydration in infants, is given early on, while the HPV vaccine, which protects against certain types of cancer, is administered later when adolescents are at a higher risk.
So they're strategically targeting these vaccines to maximize effectiveness and provide the most protection at the right times.
That's the goal, yeah. It's about tailoring the approach to each stage of a child's development to make sure that they're getting the best protection possible. And, this kind of leads into another common concern, which is the safety of receiving multiple vaccines at once.
Right. This is something I hear about a lot from our listeners. And it does seem like a lot for a young immune system to handle all at once. Is there any evidence to support that concern?
Yeah, it's understandable to kind of wonder about that, especially when you see the list of all the vaccines that are given in those early years.
Mm.
But both Dr. Gower and Dr. Talat, they really emphasize that extensive studies have shown time and time again that giving multiple vaccines at the same time is safe, and it doesn't actually compromise the immune response at all.
So it's not actually overwhelming their system like some people might worry about?
Not at all. Dr. Talat actually gives a really great analogy to illustrate this point. She points out that our bodies are constantly bombarded by tons of bacteria and viruses every day, just from doing normal things like breathing and touching stuff. Our immune systems are literally built to handle this constant exposure. So a few extra vaccines are really nothing compared to what our bodies are already dealing with.
That's a really helpful way to think about it. It makes those multiple vaccines seem much less daunting.
Yeah, exactly. It's about understanding the incredible capacity and complexity of our immune systems. But of course, we can't really talk about vaccines without acknowledging that, side effects exist.
Right, so let's unpack that a little bit. What are some of the most common side effects that we see? And are there any rare but serious side effects that parents should be aware of?
Yeah, so it's important to kind of differentiate, between the common mild side effects and the rare or more serious ones. Most kids, they just experience minor discomfort, like soreness in the arm where they got the shot, maybe a low-grade fever, some fussiness, but this usually goes away within a day or two.
Okay, so more of a temporary thing than any serious concern.
Exactly. But as with any medical intervention, there's those rare cases where more serious side effects can happen.
Can you give an example of what one of those might be?
Sure. So the article talks about myocarditis and pericarditis, which are basically inflammation of the heart muscle or the lining around the heart. And these were identified as very rare side effects, particularly in adolescents and young adult males after getting the COVID-19 vaccine.
Okay, that does sound pretty concerning. But I remember the article also mentioned that the risk of getting those complications is actually much higher if you actually get the disease itself than it is from getting the vaccine.
Yeah, you're exactly right. With COVID-19, the risk of developing myocarditis or pericarditis after getting infected with the virus was much higher than the risk from the vaccines.
So that's really important to keep in mind. We should be aware of the potential side effects, but we also need to, keep those risks in perspective.
Absolutely. And it's why, having transparent and accurate information is so important in these discussions. People need to have all the facts so they can make informed decisions. And this leads us to another critical aspect of this whole conversation, which is the process of how vaccines are developed and tested.
Yeah, I'm actually really curious about that. It's easy to just kind of take vaccines for granted, but I'm sure there's a whole complex journey from the lab to our doctor's offices.
Oh, for sure. It's a multi-phase process.
Hmm.
A lot of research, testing, and oversight involved to make sure that these things are safe and effective.
Okay, so can you walk us through the main stages of this process? Like, what does it take for a vaccine to actually get approved?
Well, it all starts with a lot of research in the lab and animal studies
Hmm.
to kind of assess the safety and potential effectiveness of a vaccine candidate. And then, if it kind of passes those first hurdles, it moves on to human clinical trials. And those typically start pretty small, maybe just a handful of volunteers.
So just a small group to kind of see how the vaccine is tolerated and if there's any immediate side effects.
Exactly. And a lot of times they'll use a placebo group during this phase. That helps them isolate the actual effects of the vaccine itself.
Oh, okay. So it's like a controlled experiment to make sure they're getting really accurate data.
Exactly. And if the vaccine looks good, safety-wise in these early trials, then it moves on to these much larger trials with hundreds or even thousands of participants.
Oh, wow. And at that stage, what are the researchers primarily looking for?
Well, they're evaluating two main things: how effective the vaccine is at actually preventing the disease, and whether any rarer side effects pop up when it's given to a larger and more diverse group of people.
So it's confirming the safety and the effectiveness in a real-world setting.
Exactly. And here's an interesting point. For new vaccines, they keep comparing them to a placebo. But for the vaccines that already exist, but are maybe getting updated or improved, the comparison is made to the current version of that vaccine, not a placebo.
Oh, right. That makes sense ethically. You wouldn't want to withhold an already proven vaccine from a control group.
Right. It's about maintaining those ethical standards while still rigorously testing new versions of vaccines. And Dr. Talat makes a really important point about this whole safety bar for vaccines. Since they're given to healthy people, the standards are incredibly high. It's a very different situation than when you're giving a treatment to someone who's already sick.
Right. So they're erring on the side of caution because they're dealing with healthy people.
Absolutely. The benefits have to significantly outweigh any potential risks before a vaccine is ever recommended for widespread use. And this super rigorous approach is a testament to just how important safety is in vaccine development.
That is reassuring to know that there's so much care and scrutiny that goes into this entire process.
Yeah, it really is. And this dedication to safety, it's super important, especially given kind of the public perception surrounding vaccines.
Right. We've talked about how effective vaccines are, how rigorously they're tested, but we can't really ignore this whole phenomenon of vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah, that's a key part of the conversation for sure. And I think it's important to approach it with a lot of empathy and understanding. There's a lot of different reasons why people might hesitate to get vaccinated or to vaccinate their kids. Some might have genuine concerns about side effects, while others might have been exposed to some misinformation, or they hold certain beliefs that influence their choices.
It seems like there's no easy answers. Where do we even begin to try to address something as complex as vaccine hesitancy?
Well, I think education is a really powerful tool. We need to be providing clear, accurate, and easy to understand information about vaccines from trustworthy sources.
So empowering people with knowledge so they can make informed decisions.
Exactly. And it's not just about throwing facts and figures at people. It's about having these really open and honest conversations that actually address their specific concerns.
So a more personalized approach, kind of acknowledging that people have these different reasons for their hesitancy.
Exactly. It's all about building trust
Yeah.
and addressing concerns with empathy and with actual evidence. But it's not just about individual choices, right? There's these bigger systemic factors that are at play too.
Right. Things like access to healthcare and cultural beliefs, even the spread of misinformation online. All these things kind of contribute to the complexity of this issue.
Yeah, for sure. If someone can't afford to see a doctor, or if there are certain cultural taboos around vaccination in their community, it creates these extra barriers. So we need to be addressing these bigger systemic issues as well as those individual concerns.
So it sounds like a multi-pronged approach is needed.
It really is. It's not something that can be solved overnight. But I do think that through open conversations, education, and really addressing those systemic barriers, we can actually make some progress.
It's a challenge worth tackling for sure, especially when you consider all the implications for public health.
Absolutely. And, that brings us back to herd immunity. It's not just about protecting ourselves. It's also about protecting the most vulnerable people in our communities.
Yeah, this whole idea of herd immunity brings up some pretty interesting ethical questions, doesn't it? How do we balance those individual rights with the needs of the collective when it comes to public health measures like vaccination?
That's a really important question. On one hand, we value individual autonomy and that freedom to make choices about our own bodies and our health.
Right, but those choices can sometimes have these ripple effects, like we've seen with the outbreak in Texas.
Exactly. When it comes to contagious diseases, our choices don't just affect us, they can impact the people around us, especially those who can't get vaccinated for medical reasons or those who are more susceptible to serious complications.
So the balancing act between individual liberty and the common good.
Yeah, it is. Finding that balance is tough. There's no easy answer. But I think one key principle is transparency. We need to be open and honest about the risks and the benefits of vaccines, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
So no hiding information or sugarcoating things.
Exactly. People need access to clear and accurate information so they can make truly informed decisions for themselves.
And fairness too, right? Like making sure everyone has equal access to vaccines and to accurate information.
Absolutely. We have to address those systemic barriers that prevent people from getting vaccinated, whether it's cost or availability or cultural factors.
And what about those people who genuinely can't be vaccinated for medical reasons? How do we make sure they're protected in a world where those vaccination rates might be dropping?
Well, that's where herd immunity is even more critical. When enough people are vaccinated, it creates that protective barrier around those who are most vulnerable. It's this idea of collective responsibility, recognizing that our individual actions can really affect the well-being of others.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful concept, this idea that we're all interconnected when it comes to public health. But let's be real for a second. There are always going to be people who are totally against vaccines, no matter what the science says.
That's true. And while it's important to respect their right to have those beliefs, even if we disagree, we also have to consider the potential consequences for public health.
So how do we navigate that tension? How do we respect individual beliefs while also protecting the health of the community?
Well, it's a constant balancing act. I think the key is to really engage in respectful dialogue, to try to understand where their concerns are coming from, and address those with empathy and evidence. But we also need to be firm in our commitment to public health and protecting those who are most vulnerable.
So it's about finding that middle ground between respecting individual autonomy and promoting the common good, which sounds like a pretty tough path to navigate.
It is. It takes ongoing conversations, a willingness to listen, and a real commitment to finding solutions that work for everyone, both individuals and society as a whole.
It reminds us that public health isn't just about science, it's also about navigating all these complex social and ethical issues.
Exactly. And one of the biggest players in shaping these conversations is the media. They have a huge influence on how people see vaccines and public health in general.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And unfortunately, the media doesn't always get it right. We see a lot of sensationalized headlines, a focus on these rare side effects, and a lot of platforms given to anti-vaccine voices that don't really have any scientific credibility.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that kind of reporting
Strategy.
can be really damaging. It erodes public trust in vaccines and contributes to vaccine hesitancy. So the question is, what can we do about it? How can the media do a better job of covering these really complex issues?
Yeah, that's the key question. What can journalists and these media outlets do to make sure that they're providing accurate and responsible coverage of vaccines and public health?
Well, it seems like responsible journalism is really key here. Journalists really have a responsibility to prioritize facts over sensationalism, to give people the context and avoid those fear-mongering tactics that can be so misleading.
Oh, absolutely. And they also need to be careful about giving platforms to those anti-vaccine voices that really don't have any scientific credibility. It's not about, silencing dissenting opinions. It's about making sure that those opinions are actually based on evidence and presented in a way that's not going to spread more misinformation.
Right. So it's about striking that balance between, presenting those different perspectives, but also upholding the integrity of scientific information.
Exactly. The media plays such a powerful role in promoting, public health literacy. And part of that is providing accurate and responsible coverage coverage of vaccines. It's a good reminder that the information we take in really shapes how we understand these complicated issues. And it's really important to be careful about where we're getting our information from.
Well said. And, speaking of the future, it's not all doom and gloom. Despite all the challenges we've been discussing, there's actually a lot of excitement and hope on the horizon when it comes to vaccine development.
Okay, now you've got me curious. What are some of these advancements that have you feeling so optimistic?
We're seeing some incredible progress in the development of mRNA vaccines, which are this relatively new type of vaccine that has shown so much potential.
Oh, yeah, the COVID-19 vaccines were mRNA vaccines, right? And they were a huge success.
Exactly. And their effectiveness has really opened up this whole new world of possibilities for using this technology to create vaccines for other diseases that have been a problem for, a really long time.
So are we talking about potentially seeing mRNA vaccines for things like cancer and HIV? Even the common cold? That almost sounds too good to be true.
I know it might sound like science fiction, but it's actually becoming a reality. Researchers are exploring all these different avenues right now, and the early results look really promising. The potential for mRNA vaccines to totally revolutionize medicine is just huge.
It's really mind-blowing to think about. And it's not just about creating brand new vaccines, right? There's also a lot of work being done to improve the vaccines that we already have.
Oh, for sure. Scientists are always looking for ways to make vaccines even more effective and longer lasting and easier to actually give to people.
Can you give us some examples of what that might look like?
Sure. So, for example, they're researching how to create vaccines that are more durable so they provide longer lasting protection. Like imagine a future where instead of getting booster shots every few years, you might only need one, like every 10 years or even once in your lifetime.
Wow, that'd be amazing, both for convenience and for cost.
Exactly. And there's also a lot of research going on into developing vaccines that are easier and less invasive to administer.
Yeah.
Like imagine nasal sprays or patches instead of those injections. That would be huge for people who are afraid of needles.
It's incredible to think about how far we've come with vaccines. And it's even more incredible to imagine what the future might hold. But as we've talked about, this spread of misinformation is a serious threat to all this progress.
It's a constant battle. Even with all these incredible scientific discoveries, we're still dealing with misinformation, especially now with the internet and how quickly information spreads.
It can feel pretty overwhelming at times. So what can we actually do to combat this misinformation? How do we make sure people have access to good information about vaccines?
It's a tough question, but I think there are a few things we can do. First and foremost, we have to support and promote credible sources of information.
So that means sticking to things like scientific journals and government health agencies and reputable news outlets.
Exactly. We need to elevate the voices of those experts and institutions that are really committed to giving evidence-based information.
But it's not enough to just, point people to the right sources. We also need to give them the tools to tell the difference between fact and fiction, especially online.
Yeah, you're right. We need to teach people how to think critically about the information they see online, how to spot fake news and propaganda, and how to identify bias and misinformation.
So it's about empowering people to be more savvy consumers of information, but it's not just an individual responsibility, is it? What role do social media platforms play in all of this?
Yeah, those social media platforms have a huge influence on how information spreads, both good and bad information. So they really need to take responsibility for curbing the spread of misinformation on their sites.
That's a tricky balance, though, right? Between free speech and protecting people from harmful content. But it's something we really need to keep talking about.
Oh, absolutely. The stakes are way too high to ignore the impact that misinformation has on public health.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about, the science behind vaccines, the reasons behind vaccine hesitancy, the ethical dilemmas, the role of the media, and even what the future might hold for vaccine development. It's a lot to think about.
It really is. And I hope our listeners have a better understanding of this really important topic.
I think they do. But beyond understanding, what are some practical things our listeners can do to promote vaccine literacy and help people make informed decisions in their own lives and their communities?
That's a great question. I think the most important thing is to educate yourself about vaccines from reliable sources. Don't just take someone's word for it, Do your own research.
So be curious, ask questions, and really dig into that information.
Exactly. And if you have questions, don't be afraid to talk to your doctor. They can give you personalized advice based on your own situation and concerns.
That's good advice. And what about those tough conversations with friends or family members who might be hesitant about vaccines? Any tips for approaching those?
Well, just listen to them with empathy and really try to see things from their perspective. Don't judge them or dismiss what they're saying. And focus on sharing accurate information from those trusted sources. Remember, those conversations should be about building connections, not creating more division.
So, meeting people where they are and having those respectful conversations, even when they're hard.
Exactly. And even if you don't change their mind right away, just planting that seed of doubt and encouraging them to look for reliable information is a huge step.
So, little by little with persistence.
Right. And remember, we're all in this together. The choices we make about vaccines can affect our whole community and the world.
This deep dive has definitely given us all a lot to think about and to act on. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insights with us.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, we really encourage you to keep learning about this topic, ask questions, have those important conversations, and be an advocate for informed decision-making when it comes to vaccines, because your health and the health of your community really does depend on it.
Well said. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay healthy, everyone.